Let me tell you what's concerning me today. What really has my concern, my interest up, and why I think these books are important and why this conversation is so vital, is that there are people in the movement that are drawn to it, but are shut down when they ask appropriate questions. And they think they're innocent questions. They're the right questions to ask. Questions like, well, why should we believe this? On what basis can I be sure that you're a prophet and that you're bringing new revelation that I should receive in addition to what I find in the Bible? These are very legitimate questions. But people who ask these questions directly of the leaders in the movement are oftentimes dissuaded from taking these questions seriously. They're urged to set them aside and simply to have faith. And sometimes they're accused for having a lack of faith and potentially jinxing the experience of the Spirit and the manifestations of the Spirit in their own lives because they entertain these questions as if to do so is somehow a moral failing as a Christian.
Okay, everyone. Welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. My name is Anthony Costello, and today I'm joined by my vice president, Lenny Esposito.
Good morning.
And two guests, both friends of the Kirkwood Center, Dr. Doug Geivett, who's here with us today, and his co-author, or maybe it's the other way around, Holly Pivec, and her co-author, Dr. Doug Geivett, authors of several books. Now, I think it's 4 or 5 books on the New Apostolic Reformation, or what we will be calling the New Apostolic Reformation, or NAR for short. So, Doug and Holly, welcome to the podcast. How are you guys doing today?
Great. It's great to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too, Tony and Lenny. Both thank you for inviting us and for hosting this event.
Well, and before we get into the content of the books that you've written and what you've been researching, why don't we start with maybe Holly? Let's start with you. Maybe just give us a little personal background, where you're from, where you studied, where you are now, what you're doing. And then we'll have Doug do the same, and then we'll get into the books.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Holly Pivec. I have a master's degree in Christian apologetics from Biola University, where I also worked as the university editor and managing editor of Biola magazine for nearly a decade. And that's where I got to know Doug. And that's also where when I first became aware of this movement. I'll share that story in a second. But so I'm a researcher of cults and aberrant religious groups, and I've written 4 books. We've written 4 books together now, Doug and I, about the New Apostolic Reformation movement. But I first learned about this movement when I was working at Biola. A reader of the magazine actually sent a letter to the editor of the magazine and said she was describing this movement that she said was taking over churches in her city, and she was very concerned about it. And it was a movement, she said, was led by apostles, and she was hoping that by writing the magazine that maybe her email could be forwarded to a professor at Talbot Seminary there at Biola, and maybe that would kind of spur someone to write a book responding to this movement and showing why the teachings are, dangerous and unbiblical. But as I read her email, it kind of caught my attention because I thought I'd pretty much heard of every religious movement and fringe group. And I didn't recognize what she was describing, this movement led by apostles and prophets. So I just went on Google and started doing some research. And I realized then, over 20 years ago, how large and influential this movement was back then, and just started digging into it. And I started thinking, there needs to be a book about this movement, explaining it. And I also realized at that time that I thought I had never heard of the movement before, but once I started learning the teachings, the practices, the lingo, the buzzwords, I realized I had come into contact with it. I even knew people who were part of it, including someone I had just started dating at that time. That's part of my story. I share in our book, Counterfeit Kingdom, that Adam, who's now my husband, was a part of this movement and since has come out of it. And he's a pastor and he now warns others about it. So that was kind of what drew me in. And then I was able to convince Doug to partner with me in, writing this book. And since then we've written 3 more together.
Okay, that's great. Well, that is some, I see already some of the motivation for why you started on this project, Doug. So tell us your side of the story. How did you get then involved? Holly mentioned a little bit, but how did you get involved with Holly's project?
Yeah, so I knew Holly when she was a student at Talbot and Biola, and also when she was the managing editor of the magazine, Biola Magazine, for the university. I'd done interviews with her and reviewed articles that she was working on. And so we knew each other already, but I learned that she had gotten married and moved to Fairbanks through a colleague. And then reconnecting, Holly told me about this project that she was working on and this interest that she had in NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation. And she invited me to participate with her, partner with her in publishing a book on this. And I think her reasons were that my background is in philosophy. I have advanced degrees in biblical studies as well. And I do quite a bit of work in different aspects of Christian thought, knowledge-related issues, and virtually any topic in Christian apologetics that might have a bearing on the credibility of our faith. Well, I told her I would be happy to support her in any way I could, but I didn't know what specific help I could offer. She sent me some of the research that she had done, and as I went through it, I really did begin to get concerned. I found that what she came up with was quite convincing on several points. One is that this is a pervasive movement. Already then, it was a global movement, and many people were being sucked into it. Second, a lot of evangelicals, and in my community of believers with whom I fellowship and work quite closely, were not familiar with this movement, but were in certain ways lending support to the movement that I found to be a bit concerning. And then I was concerned about how this relates to issues that I do think about quite a bit, having to do with the credibility of our faith in a culture that is quite cynical about religion, or at least about organized religion, as it's sometimes called, and certainly about Christianity. And I thought, our reputation is at stake here with the world, and something needs to be done to set the record straight that this is an aberrant movement and not to be confused with the historic faith that goes back to Jesus and the apostles themselves. This despite the fact that the movement, NAR movement, is led by people who presume to be apostles. So that makes it even more challenging. And then I was concerned about individuals that were caught in the movement, that didn't have resources and means of evaluating what they were confronted with. Many people are drawn to it in ways that we may talk about today, but that prevent them from being able to apply appropriate standards for evaluating or assessing whether this is the truth and whether we should organize our lives around the principles of NAR. So, and because the supernatural and the miraculous present themselves as such a major feature of the movement, and having written extensively on miracles, just to illustrate, I thought maybe I could be helpful in that regard. And so, and I was happy to partner with Holly, knowing of her from before. And that partnership has been very good. I think that we've obviously we wouldn't have done 4 books together over a period of years and appear like this together and now doing some speaking together if it wasn't a good working relationship. And so I've been real fulfilled in that role as well, being able to bring whatever expertise I can to the topic. But let me tell you what's concerning me today. Today, What really has my concern, my interest up, and why I think these books are important and why this conversation is so vital, is that there are people in the movement that are drawn to it, but are shut down when they ask appropriate questions, and they think they're innocent questions. They're the right questions to ask. Questions like, well, why should we believe this? Who on what basis can I be sure that you're a prophet and that you're bringing new revelation that I should receive in addition to what I find in the Bible? These are very legitimate questions. But people who ask these questions directly of the leaders in the movement are oftentimes dissuaded from taking these questions seriously. They're urged to set them aside and simply to have faith. And sometimes they're accused for having a lack of faith and potentially jinxing the experience of the Spirit and the manifestations of the Spirit in their own lives because they entertain these questions as if to do so is somehow a moral failing as a Christian. That really does concern me. And I not only believe, but I would now say we have very strong evidence that there are many in the movement that are sitting through church services at NAR churches and in NAR organizations, wondering whether the things that they're hearing really are true, and whether the promises that are made are ever really fulfilled and realized. And we're seeing people leave the movement. There is a movement now. It's a counter movement, a resistance movement, you might say, including people who have left the movement and have tales to tell about the damage they experienced emotionally, spiritually, psychologically in their families that were divided over the issues. And then theologically, people even reporting that after leaving, they're no longer sure that they were worshiping the real Jesus when they were part of the movement.
Right. Well, that's good. I mean, I think you kind of front loaded a lot there, but that highlights how important this topic is. And I want to revisit a lot of what you said about, especially about the psychological effects of the NAR churches that are having on people and how it's splitting families apart and everything.
Well, I'd be happy to start maybe just giving explain quickly what the core teaching of NAR is, and then and give a history of how we got there.
Yeah,
if that would be helpful.
Yeah, let's do that, Holly.
Okay, so the core teaching of NAR is that apostles and prophets are supposed to govern the church. They're supposed to hold the highest offices in the church, and all others, including pastors, elders, everyone else is supposed to submit to them. And so it's this belief that there are these governing offices, these hierarchical offices in church government. And the reason they would say that you need those offices is because they're the only two, apostles and prophets are the only two offices that are authorized by God to bring new revelation that the church needs. This is critical revelation that the church needs to bring God's kingdom to earth. And so for all believers to learn to develop miraculous powers. And so like this great end time army can rise up, and with these miraculous powers and waging spiritual warfare, they can bring God's kingdom to earth. But these NAR teachings are basically rehashed doctrines from the latter rain movement of the post World War II era, so the late 1940s, 1950s. There was this movement that basically taught all of these same things, but it grew quickly, but then fizzled out quickly because the Assemblies of God, the largest Pentecostal denomination in the world, condemned the teachings of this movement. And so it quickly fizzled out and kind of went underground. But authoritative prophets and apostles started coming back up into churches like independent charismatic churches in the 1980s and 1990s. Mm-hmm. They started rising up. And C. Peter Wagner was a church growth professor who has passed away, but he was very influential, a leading voice in the church growth movement, like in the 1980s, 1990s. And he was at Fuller Seminary for about 30 years, so he had a long tenure there. And during that time, he said he started noticing the features of what were the fastest growing churches in the world. And one feature he noticed about these churches was that they were led by apostles. And so he ended up writing about 6 books on apostles. And he wrote a book that was very influential called Churchquake, How the New Apostolic Reformation is Shaking Up the Church as We Know It, something like that. And being at Fuller, he started introducing this idea of apostles leading the church to kind of the larger academic world, started popularizing these NAR teachings, and he actually came up with the label New Apostolic Reformation.
Okay.
And he said it was new because it was a new movement, but it's apostolic because of the central role of apostles in governing the church. And it's a reformation because its effects would be as big as or even greater than the Protestant Reformation. And so he kind of started systematizing the teachings that he saw these churches promoting. And he also worked very closely with a man named Bill Heyman, who's a very influential prophet in this movement. And Bill Heyman actually was a young man during the Latter Rain movement. And so Bill Heyman brought in a lot of the Latter Rain teachings and into the New Apostolic Reformation. And Peter Wagner was systematizing these teachings in the books. And Wagner worked very closely with a lot of people who became leading apostles and prophets in this movement, like Chuck Pierce or Cindy Jacobs, Cheon, who's still a very influential apostle today. He's over a network of tens of thousands of churches that look to him as their apostle globally. And so a number of leaders worked with Peter Wagner closely. He started the Wagner Leadership Institute, which was basically a seminary, kind of like a seminary to train up leaders for this movement. But it's not like a seminary where people would go to, study Greek and Hebrew and it was to go to learn to become apostles and prophets and wage spiritual warfare and learn how to work miracles and that kind of thing. So an unaccredited school. But anyways, so a lot of those people who were connected with Wagner are still around promoting these teachings. But there's a lot of people who didn't have a direct relationship with Wagner, but they're still promoting all of these core teachings that he wrote about in his books about apostles and prophets and their role in bringing the kingdom to earth through critical new revelation. And so people like Bill Johnson at Bethel Church in Redding, California, the home to Bethel Music, which a lot of your viewers will know about. He's a leader in this movement. Jesus Culture came out of Bethel Church in Redding. You still have Cheon, like I mentioned, at Harvest Rock Church in Pasadena. You have Randy Clark is a leading apostle in this movement in Pennsylvania. Thinking of other ones, Heidi Baker would be a leader in this movement. Are there other names, Doug, that you can think of that?
I don't know if you mentioned Rick Joyner. He would be.
No, Rick Joyner. Yeah, Rick Joyner is another big one.
Now, one name that's been in the news recently has been Mike Bickle at the I think it's the International House of Prayer is the name of the church.
Yeah,
IHOP.
Very influential organization. So really Bethel Church in Redding is the most popular and well-known church today in this movement. But next to that, the International House of Prayer in Kansas City was very high up. And of course, that people who have been following what's happened there, IHOP has basically been imploding because of the scandals that have arisen there in relation to Mike Bickle, who many viewed as a prophet in this movement, even though he would deny that he was a prophet. Many viewed him that way, and that's become apparent in the aftermath of what's been happening there.
Another relatively high-profile figure because of his global reach, especially in Africa, would be Daniel Kolenda. He's also in the NAR camp.
Successor
when you say, I mean, you mentioned somebody by the name of Cheon. Now, I don't know if I don't know where that he would be from. Is he not a native-born American? Is he from some other part of the world, or?
Well, he's been at Harvest Rock Church in Pasadena for many years. He's the apostle and senior pastor there, and he started an apostolic network, like I mentioned, that's over tens of thousands of churches globally.
Thousands of churches.
And there are many apostolic networks like this. And what churches will join networks because they feel the need to be under the covering, that's a NAR buzz phrase, a spiritual covering, or to come under the authority of an apostle, or else they're outside of God's proper will for church government. And so churches will join these networks, and Bethel Church has its own network in Reading, or Randy Clark has a network called Global Awakening. Rick Joyner has a network, and people will join these networks. Pastors will join so that their church can be properly aligned under the authority of an apostle.
Okay. I mean, because I don't want this to get lost, this idea that this is a global movement. This is not just in California and Kansas.
No,
and
Cheon's, the churches in Cheon's network are
international
throughout the world. And the same with Bethel Church's influence is global as well. No, this is a global movement. And in fact, the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell, according to their statistics, this movement is responsible for much of the church growth that's taking part in the global South, in Africa and Asia and Latin America. In the United States alone, about 3.5 million people attend churches that are part of apostolic networks. So they've joined a network, and they overtly embrace the NAR vision. But many more attend churches that are influenced in varying degrees by these NAR teachings, because apostles and prophets are invited in to speak. They read their books. So but then outside the U.S., it's also a very large and influential movement.
Okay. That's great. Yeah.
International travels, I run into it myself.
Yeah.
It's strong in Australia, South Africa, on the European continent. And we get correspondence from people all over the world asking for translations of our books into their languages so that they can help spread the word, because they're seeing this proliferate as well. And this is not by accident. The leaders of the movement that we've mentioned are very intentional about spreading the word and marketing their theology to the world. And they've been quite successful in doing that through various streams.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Was there a Bible translation connected to NAR? What was it called? The Passion?
Yeah, the Passion Translation is produced by a NAR apostle named Brian Simmons, who claimed that Jesus Christ personally visited him, commissioned him to produce a new translation of the Bible.
That's always
he claims it's a translation, so he doesn't claim it's a paraphrase. He claims it's a translation, but he admits that he has minimal background in the biblical languages, but he claims to receive divine downloads from God that enable him to translate and to have received secrets of the Hebrew language. He also claims to work from Aramaic manuscripts that don't exist. He would claim like the New Testament was originally written in the Aramaic, and he works from those manuscripts. But he's basically taken a lot of NAR teachings and snuck them into the text to make it sound like the Bible supports these teachings.
What's fascinating in all this is if you were to put this side by side with Mormonism, the LDS movement, you're seeing all of the same parallels and all of the same claims. The idea that the church needs to be restored, that the apostles and prophets are the heads, the only divine source of leadership within the church, that there's a new translation that's coming down directly from God. You're seeing all of these
new manuscripts,
parallels, even new manuscripts. And this is kind of part of what I wanted to get to when I started asking about things like what a cult is, because usually when you use the term cult in a religious sense, not only does it mean a deviation from, say, a historic norm or the historic creeds, there's usually also certain aspects like God's inside man. So one of the aspects of all cults that I've run across is there's Charles Taze Russell, it's Joseph Smith, it's David Koresh. There's always God's inside man. There's always secret knowledge. We have something that the rest of the church is missing, right? And you need to adopt that. And the third thing is there's always some kind of additional teaching, additional writings, a special book, a special guide that is exclusive to this new movement. And those three things have traditionally, in my experience, been the differentiator between historic Christianity, which has obviously divisions within it. I mean, Eastern Orthodox and Copts and Protestantism and Roman Catholicism all have differences, but none of them have those three dynamics that you would see in NAR, that you would see in Jehovah's Witnesses, that you would see in Branch Davidians. It's interesting, Holly, in your litany of leaders, Todd Bentley gets like completely skipped over. Funny how that just happens. But anyway, that's a second question. But I wanted to get that's kind of why I was kind of teasing out this idea of cult versus aberrancy versus, heterodoxy. I think those ideas are really important to understand.
So Doug and Holly,
yeah.
I know, Lenny, we lost you there for a second, but Doug and Holly, I think you got most of what Lenny was saying about the, these three main features of cults. So where do you guys where are you guys placing NAR then?
Well, I would say on all the points that Lenny mentioned, you do see resemblances with NAR on all those points. Now, there are a couple of other points that are often made in connection with cults and are typical of many cults. Some are the sociological dimensions and the psychology that's involved, how people get sucked in and what it is that attracts them, and then how they become sort of obsessed with the leader and what the leader has to say, and the high regard for that leader, and the unquestioning spirit that they have about everything, and how willing they are to just follow the leader's instructions. There's that. There's also overt heterodoxy that's often associated with cults, denials of fundamental or key features of the Christian tradition, the historic Orthodox faith, that the different groups do have in common, different denominations have in common, the Orthodox have in common, the Roman Catholics have in common. Still, there are these departures. So denials of the humanity of Jesus or denials of the deity of Jesus. Completely different conception of the gospel, and these are fundamental ways in which cults can differ, even on the nature of God. Arguably, the Mormon tradition is more of a polytheistic tradition than it is monotheistic. Well, now here is where NAR differs from cults of that sort, because I do think that the psychological and sociological dynamics are at play, and that people are sort of deliberately, strategically put in a position to feel like if they're not experiencing the miracles, it's their own problem, it's their own fault, it's a lack of faith or what have you. And there's fear. I think fear is induced among the rank and file within the movement, who don't want to miss out on God's blessings, and they think that they're just around the corner. If they just hang in there, they'll experience them as well. And and they're reluctant to walk away from it many times, because there's a kind of sometimes the censure is extreme, that there'll be an evil spirit that has to do with it, and nobody wants to be accused of that. So that psychological and cultural sociological dimension of cult-like activity is present as well. And it's one of the main reasons why we hear from people asking, is it a cult? But the other one is where they've provided themselves with some significant cover, because as far as we can tell with our close research of the kinds of figures that we've been describing so far, they do not deny any of the elements of the classic creeds of the church. Some people think they do, or some people think they come perilously close to doing so. For example, Bill Johnson has said he's got a kind of kenosis doctrine concerning Jesus, according to which Jesus, although he was fully God and fully man while here on the earth, he set aside the use of his divine power in all that he did while on the earth, including his miracles, so that when he performed miracles, again, while he was still fully God and could have performed them, presumably, using his own direct divine energy, he didn't. And he relied instead, as a man of faith, filled with the Spirit, on the Spirit for the performance of all the miracles that he performed. Now, that's not in itself heretical, but you can see how some people would say, well, that is tantamount to denying his deity. Well, it's denying that his deity functioned a certain way, but they still say, explicitly that they believe that he was fully God. So that's a point of difference between NAR, typically a point of difference between NAR leaders who appear to be orthodox but aberrant. That's the term that we've used so far without definition in many of its other teachings. So, and I think this is strategic. There are many indicators that leaders in the movement, and Bill Johnson and his crew at Bethel Church in Redding, California, illustrate this effectively. They campaign and market themselves as if they are part of the Orthodox strain of the church to waylay concerns about that, and then they do these add-on things that really define them as a church and make them distinctive from the historic faith and novel. It is genuinely novel. So you have to go after those particular points if you can't press them on questions of orthodoxy.
Well, let's dig into a little bit more to some of these very specific theological claims they're making, because this is where I think the rubber hits the road is, so let's dig in a little bit more into these claims about offices, right? And how these offices are supposed to function and how people filling these offices are somehow specially connected to the Holy Spirit, because that's obvious. That seems to be the most disconcerting part of the whole thing. And that's also where they can sort of claim the authority that they have. So I don't know, can we dig in a little bit more into those doctrines that they're teaching, the things that they're adding to?
I wonder if I could go back and say one more thing that's related to what Lenny brought up, related to cults, because I was thinking about this last night. We were actually, we're leading a discussion group for our most recent book, Reckless Christianity. And we were having this discussion about similar things last night. And it occurred to me that another similarity between NAR at a place like Bethel Church, for example, and a group like the Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is that it's their extra revelation that is center stage for them. And while they affirm the authority of Scripture and they believe it's inspired, and that's an advantage that we have, by the way, is that when we talk to people that are caught in this movement, they already respect the Word of God as such, and they regard it as the inspired Word of God, and they want to believe it and follow it. That's something they're committed to. So their leaders have not taken that from them, but they've added on, and it's these things, these add-ons, that actually are the hallmark of their ministries. So the Scriptures are subordinated in effect, but not in principle. In principle, they're foundational, but in practice, in actual practice, the apostle either comes up with new revelation and new truths that people long to hear because they pertain to our present circumstances, and sometimes they're quite individually significant. But also because these leaders will also interpret Scripture in ways that they think they can, because of the authority and insight that they have. So they exercise a special kind of prophetic illumination. And when they preach from the text, you might not be able to see the source for their message in the text itself, but that doesn't matter because the apostle has new insight into its meaning. All right, so now here's the similarity that's quite significant to me. It's very striking. If you're talking to a Mormon, like I have oftentimes talked to Mormons, and my practice is to say, well, first to confirm what I already know, that they believe that the Bible is inspired by God. And I'll say that I believe that as well, but I don't believe that about the Book of Mormon or their other documents. So why don't we, because we have that in common, just restrict our conversation initially to those things we both believe to be the Word of God, namely the Bible, the Old and New Testaments. And I've been involved in discussions with Mormons like this who've tried to prove their Mormon doctrines to me from the Bible. And of course, it's a hopeless enterprise. And they soon discover this, and they're reaching then for the Book of Mormon, which is also bound in leather with gilt edges and ribbons. And sometimes they've even tried to fool me as if they're still quoting from the Bible. And now I know the Bible well enough to know they're not. And so I've asked them, well, what is that from? What's the source there? Oh, you caught me. That was the Book of Mormon. That's the point I want to make here, is that when they want to support their distinctive doctrines, they have to look for sources outside of the scriptures. And that's true for NAR as well. That doesn't make them a cult. That doesn't make them heterodox, but it does mean that all of their distinctives, which is what they're really all about, day to day, 24/7, and what their main message is, whether it's through their music, their preaching, their YouTube videos, or what have you, their School of Supernatural Ministries, all of that relies heavily on extra biblical revelation, another source than the Bible. And so if you were to demand that we have a conversation together using only the Bible, they would be practically speechless, or they would have to insinuate their authority as apostles and try to override whatever interpretation that you had for the same scriptures that they were using. So I just wanted to come back to that, because while it's true, I wouldn't say that they're a cult. I would say that this is another feature that they have in common. Lenny did hit on it, but I want to strike an important emphasis here, that it's so their distinctives are so fundamentally dependent on these other revelations that if you took those away from them, their distinctives would evaporate and they'd be out of business.
So, okay, Holly, maybe I'll come to you, since Doug just gave us a lot of information there. But with regards to the distinctives, then, I mean, you've written 4 books now. I mean, let's highlight maybe more specifically, if we can, what kind of distinct things are coming out of this apparently other source of revelation that these apostles are claiming to have.
Right. So a lot of things. So we've already hit on their teachings about church governance, that apostles working together with prophets are supposed to govern the church. All others submit to them.
And is there a process for how those apostles are discovered?
Yeah, let's define what an apostle is.
Or anointed. How do we know which ones?
They would say God is the one who, chooses apostles. They'll often be recognized by others during like a commissioning ceremony, where maybe other apostles and prophets will lay hands on them. Or, I mean, if someone like Bill Johnson says that somebody else is he's a leading apostle, if someone else is a prophet or apostle, people will just accept that, so it's kind of like they regard each other as apostles and prophets. And, so another distinctive teaching though, so this is very different than, like historic Pentecostal or charismatic teaching, because in historic Pentecostal and charismatic teaching, they'll talk about the miraculous gifts or the spiritual gifts of prophecy, speaking in tongues, healing, those kind of things. But in NAR, they're not just talking about that. They're saying that in addition to these miraculous gifts that some people have from God, like the ability to prophesy or heal or speak in tongues, they would say that in addition to that, there's these authoritative offices. And so when a prophet prophesies in the office, he has much more authority than someone with merely just a spiritual gift. It's the amount of authority that's attached to it. So that's why many Pentecostals and charismatics are actually very concerned about this movement, because it's the level of authority that these prophets and apostles are claiming, along with a lot of their other distinctive teachings, have brought a lot of division and damage even in Pentecostal and charismatic churches. But other distinctive teachings that are related to that are like that every believer can have every miraculous gift. Every believer can and should prophesy, heal the sick, raise the dead. And they would say that that's something that every believer can and should be doing, because they're trying to raise up this miracle working army to bring God's kingdom to earth. And that's their take on the Great Commission. They would actually say the Great Commission is taking dominion of the nations and bringing heaven to earth, or bringing God's kingdom to earth. And that the reason the church hasn't been able to complete this Great Commission for 2,000 years is because the apostles and prophets with their new revelations have been missing. But so the way people will learn to prophesy in this movement, though, is by taking part in what they call activation exercises. And so they'll go to like Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry or other schools of supernatural ministry that are patterned after the one at Bethel, or maybe even use the curriculum at Bethel, or they have their own curriculum. And they will seek to learn to become miracle workers, essentially. So like what Bethel has promoted are activities like having two people who have never prophesied before get together. One might be blindfolded, one or both might be blindfolded, and so they don't know who the other person is, and they're supposed to just say whatever pops in their head without filtering it is a prophetic word for that other person. And they really teach them it's important not to filter it. The only requirements is that they're positive words, they're affirming words. But other than that, they're supposed to just say whatever pops into their head. When I went to Bethel Church in Reading, I attended their adult Sunday school class, and they were teaching people to prophesy that day. And so they would call people who had never prophesied before to come to the front of the room, just pick someone in the audience they didn't know, and just start prophesying, giving revelation, what they thought God was saying to that person. So this doctrine of activation of spiritual gifts or miraculous gifts is something that's peculiar to NAR. They also have a peculiar take on the gospel. They say that the gospel of salvation, that Christ's death on the cross made the way for forgiveness of sin, for reconciliation with God, and for eternal life, that's only part of the story. That the full gospel is that that Christ's work on the cross enabled us to take dominion of the nations and of the earth. And so they call that the gospel of the kingdom. So that's another difference. And along with that is their view of the Great Commission, that it's not a commission just to take Jesus's teachings and make disciples of the nations. They'll say it's actually to take dominion of the nations. So we're supposed to disciple not just individuals, but nations.
What do they mean by, can we dominion there? What exactly is that? Maybe they're not very specific what they mean when they say dominion, but.
Well, they promote the kingdom now view of dominionism. So there's different varieties of dominionism, but in the kingdom now view, the idea is that the apostles and prophets are giving new revelations that will enable the church to rise up and take socio-political control of the nations.
So is there a tie here? Christian nationalism is obviously it's a term that's getting thrown around quite a bit, and nobody really knows. It's going to depend on who you're talking to. Mm-hmm. But is there some sense that some of the Christian ideas about Christian nationalism that are being thrown around right now are connected to this kingdom now theology? If that's a coherent question or not, but
let me speak to that.
Yeah,
I would say that there are varieties of Christian nationalism, and in some varieties, they are especially attractive to NAR leaders. And you see this emphasis among some more than others. But this question obviously arises because these are people who purport to be Christians, standing within the traditional stream, who think that all of these sectors of society, they speak of the Seven Mountain Mandate, where there are these 7 sectors of social influence, societal influence, including government, will be controlled through apostolic leadership. And so they're constantly alert to who on the horizon politically, whether it's at the national level or the local level, might be a good candidate for playing this role. Now, that figure doesn't have to be an apostle himself or herself, but could come under the authority of one, either as a matter of explicit concession, or it could be inadvertent. And so many of them are very supportive, for example, of Donald Trump, and they believe that his policies serve their purposes and he's God's man of the hour. And they've thought this for a number of years. And some of their rank, the prophets among them, have even prophesied predictive prophecy that Trump would win re-election in 2020, which of course he did not. So they have a failed prophecy. It's documented that they specifically prophesied that he would be reelected during that term and that he would sit in the Oval Office again instead of Joseph Biden. Why Donald Trump? Well, it's not, I don't think it's because they've received a revelation that he's God's man for the hour. It's just that he's the candidate who has had the greatest success at connecting with that sector of society in the United States. And we see it, of course. So what Trump himself is actually thinking about his relationship to this organization, this group, is kind of beside the point, as long as there's an affinity of political thinking and similar goals. So yes, in fact, because of this, because some high-profile NAR leaders also, or people suspected of being NAR for various reasons, are also classified by some as Christian nationalists. There are many in the secular media in our country who believe that the overlap is dramatic, that there's just virtually a one-to-one correspondence between people who are Christian nationalists and people who are part of the NAR movement. Now, this is a lack of discretion on their part, but they're not totally mistaken. There is significant overlap. It's just that it's not true that anybody who would self-identify as a Christian nationalist is necessarily NAR, or anybody who is NAR is beating the drum for Christian nationalism in a very obvious way. But there is a strong connection there. So even our current leader of the House of Representatives in the Republican Party, he is accused of being both NAR and a Christian nationalist. And of course, this provides fodder for alarmism among those on the left and in the media who are either genuinely frightened about the prospects of having someone like him in such a role, or they just want other people to be frightened of it so that they'll vote for more leftist leaders.
Yeah, I mean, boy, that brings up a whole nother can. That's certainly a problem, because I mean, there are those of us who are obviously trying to have a better argument for something like a Christian society and the need for a Judeo-Christian basis for our institutions of governance and jurisprudence. But that can obviously be articulated in a way that has nothing to do with something like a dominionism or dominion kingdom now theology.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, I don't understand how they can claim this idea that all people should be able to exercise all these spiritual gifts. Seems to me a direct denial of 1 Corinthians 12, but that's beside the point. Because of the heavy emphasis on leadership, the International Churches of Christ about 20 years ago and the shepherding movement that came out of that seemed to have a very similar parallel. So the first question I want to ask is there connections there? Because they were centered out of the mid-Kansas area, and then they grew to Florida. So there's a lot of problems with the ICOC, but they were kind of an aberrant movement coming out of the Churches of Christ field, and I don't know that they were coming out of the Pentecostal strain per se. So I'd like to find out if there's any connection there. And then I'd also want to talk about some of these spiritual things that we'd heard about, the golden feathers, the angel feathers, the golden dust, the speaking, barking and holy laughter, and all of those signs that a lot of these movements point to that are really just kind of emotive kind of provocations. So, or
hoaxes. I wonder, or are they hoaxes?
And there's hoaxes as well. There's deliberate deceptions that are going on also. So.
Two questions there.
Yeah. The shepherding movement is definitely, there are connections with that. We actually talk about that in our book, Reckless Christianity. We actually, I was looking for the page where we address this in our book, but the leaders in NAR will acknowledge that there were abuses during the shepherding movement, and they will say that they're careful not to replicate those things in the modern NAR movement, even though they won't necessarily admit that they're part of NAR. But So I found it here. It says many Christian leaders, including many contemporary NAR leaders, have criticized the shepherding movement's teachings and practices for being spiritually abusive, indicated by excessive one-on-one control exerted by leaders over individuals' lives. But NAR leaders stress the need to form covenant relationships with church leaders who provide a spiritual covering for their followers, though without the same formal pyramid-like organizational structure of the shepherding movement, a difference that does not fully ensure that abuse never arises. So there are, and they're sensitive to that because of the history of charismatic leaders being involved with the shepherding movement. They are very sensitive to criticisms of any connections between the present NAR movement and the shepherding movement.
And they're going to be even more sensitive now, if not on that particular point, but about spiritual abuse in light of what's happened at IHOP with Mike Bickle and others. And
do you guys want to elaborate on that? Or I don't know, maybe it's up to you. Do you want to elaborate more for the audience?
Yeah, a lot of folks may not know what we're referring
Mike
to.
Bickle
so IHOP is the International House of Prayer, originally in Kansas City, still in Kansas City, but now there are many campuses, IHOP campuses or satellite organizations around the world. And they've trained a number of their own young people to spread out and establish IHOP centers that focus fundamentally on 24/7 prayer. At Kansas City, the Kansas City location, that Holly and I have both visited. We've interviewed with Mike Bickle, though it's been a few years now, and had a tour of their campus. They have a room where people are always praying. So people pray on a schedule and they sign up or are delegated to be there for worship and prayer, and it's nonstop. And they have a camera running and it's live streamed to anybody who wants to tune in and see what's going on. They can watch the events of their prayer services round the clock. And that's their sort of hallmark ministry. But what people don't fully understand is what they mean by prayer when they talk about prayer. And that's something we should probably be talking about at some point. Yeah. Another thing is that Mike Bickle also received revelation from God for this purpose, and also has some unique teachings of his own that have been hallmarks of the ministry there. This goes back, let's see, what year did IHOP begin? That was it's been about 20 years, I guess it is. Isn't it, Holly?
Yeah, I would have to.
I think it's about 20 years. Prior to that, Mike Bickle was serving in various capacities as a young man, coming up through the ranks in churches and so forth. But in the fall of 2023, just a few months ago, a group of individuals who had formerly been leaders and partners in ministry with Mike Bickle at IHOP, but were no longer leaders there, revealed that they had been in conversation with a number of women who were victims of sexual abuse dealt by Mike Bickle himself. And so, that became quite a controversial thing. There was an investigation launched. There are various places you can go online to catch up with the details. One source for that would be Julie Roy's. The Julie Roy's report has followed this pretty closely and done a pretty good job, I think, of reporting on the events that have transpired. And so if you're watching this and you don't know anything about it, but you're interested in learning, that would be one place to turn. But if you just Google it, you'll see lots of chatter, lots of discussion about the events that transpired. But what ultimately emerged is that Mike Bickle, even before and then during the founding of IHOP, he was already involved in sexual escapades with women. Some of them were minors. And so he's been accused of being a sexual predator, of using his authority as having prophetic authority and apostolic authority to convince them of things, that what they were doing was okay, it was acceptable. He even prophesied that his wife was going to die and that the partner that he was grooming, as they say, would become his spouse eventually. His wife is still living, actually. And one reason why there are multiple reports of this is that some who were willing to keep silent up to a point in time learned that they were not the only ones who were being told these things and had been groomed in this same way, using precisely the same prophetic claims about his wife and so forth. And so that was an eye-opening experience for those who'd had earlier encounters with Mike Bickle. So now it's all out in the open, and others have had to leave the ministry. There are not just rumors now, but confirmed reports and testimonies from Misty Edwards, who's one of their leading worship. She's a composer and a musician who's been affiliated with IHOP for quite a number of years. And she's acknowledged some involvement of a similar kind with a married man who was also involved in worship there. And so it's an ongoing story of one case after another being exposed, where from the very beginning and even before, while Mike Bickle was purportedly receiving revelations from God for the establishment of this ministry, these other things were going on. Now, I believe that it establishes that he was never a legitimate prophet or apostle, and that his closest friends have often defended him and provided protection without vetting him properly, because if they had, they would have known not to regard him as one who had this kind of authority and insight into spiritual things. But they did. This includes people like Michael Brown recently has been doing this, defending him. Now they acknowledge that, of course, Bickle has done things that are unconscionable, but I don't know how they defend their defense of him over the years, when on our criteria, he never really had a legitimate claim to having that authority in the first place. And it's been a house of cards from the beginning. Yeah. And there are still some people who want to defend the IHOP vision, which was Mike Bickle's vision, received directly from God and implemented by him. They still want to protect the vision for this and carry it on globally, even if they have to kick Mike Bickle to the side because of his actions. But we want to say that his actions demonstrate that his vision was not itself a vision received from God. And so it needs to be reviewed from scratch and dismantled and reconsidered as if it's all being presented for the first time. I think if you do that and you put it under the microscope, you'll find that it's not a genuine prayer movement, insofar as the way they understand the nature of prayer is a far cry from the biblical conception of petitionary prayer is. So we could be talking about that difference as well.
Yeah. No, I want to get to their conception of prayer, and also maybe come back to this activation of spiritual gifts.
Okay.
One thing I'll go off on a little bit of an aside here, because I studied this a little bit. I wrote an article on this a couple years back when all the things related to Ravi Zacharias started to break. And there is a history in the church, and I found this all the way back in Irenaeus Against Heresies, book 2. I found examples of charismatic leaders. He calls, Irenaeus speaks of a Marcus the magician, who is using his charismatic and prophetic gifts to lure women into his chambers. And you can kind of figure out what Irenaeus is talking about there.
Yeah.
And it's something to be aware of. It seems to be throughout church history. There are other examples, I think, of someone like a Jean Vanier, who was on his way to being beatified by the Catholic Church, before it was later found out after his death that he was doing things very similarly as a Mike Bickle, luring women in, and he was thought to be very charismatic and connected with the Spirit and so on and so forth. And there are others I can think of as well. So it's something to be aware of, because it's quite the demonic infiltration into what appears to be, the confines of the church. But let's get into these other two issues then. Let's talk about what their idea of prayer is. Because Doug, you and I have spoken about this a couple times, that this isn't quite what we understand in the Orthodox sense to be prayer, intercessory prayer. So let's get into that.
I think Doug should explain that, but I just wanted to mention, so for the 24/7 prayer, Mike Bickle claims, Doug already mentioned this a little bit, but Mike Bickle claimed that God mandated him to raise up 24/7 prayer occurring around the earth. And that's in order so that Christ can return, that he was mandated to have 24/7 prayer going nonstop at these prayer rooms throughout the earth. And that was a requirement to bring God's kingdom to earth.
Well, and it is interesting because there is a sense of where, like, you can see, like, Paul talks about praying unceasingly. So,
right.
But then, okay, because this is where sort of the subtle deception comes into play, because there's something kind of biblical there for sure about constant prayer, but then what do they for and how it's being conducted is not quite what not quite right.
And that's what people will say. And when Doug explains prayer, it will become clear what they're doing. And people will say, well, how could you possibly criticize IHOP for promoting 24/7 prayer? Well, there is the issue of he claims to have received a revelation from God that 24/7 prayer is actually required for the church to be taking part in, that you have to have these 24/7 prayer rooms where people are engaging in nonstop, taking shifts, doing around the clock prayer. That is an issue of itself, but then also what Doug will explain with declaration prayer.
This is choreographed prayer. This is 24/7 according to a certain pattern and at a certain location under leadership of a certain sort, right, involving the prophetic and the apostolic. This isn't the sort of thing that Paul is talking about when he says pray without ceasing. He's actually urging that upon every believer to have a mind and a spirit of prayer at all times. And that means that whether you're in Kansas City at the IHOP campus or in Santiago, Chile, you can be doing that. And every believer can and should be engaged in that kind of life, have that kind of lifestyle where it's in effect, your life is a constant communion with God. There is a fitting sense of that for sure. But they have a certain mandate they received from God to do this at their location and then to spread it globally. So there's a sense that there's something special going on at IHOP. That also is a foreign, that concept is foreign. It's almost like this is the house of God, the temple or the tabernacle, if you will, where special things happen because God is uniquely present there. God being omnipresent, but specially present in a way spiritually that enlivens the activity that's going on there. And it's important that it be broadcast and streamed live globally. So there are all sorts of features of this that are on top of the simple admonition to be prayerful all the time, to always live your life in a posture of prayer. That is our spiritual worship, right? That's our spiritual service. We are to do that. That doesn't mean that we're always on our knees. It doesn't mean that we're always articulating in sentences words invoking God's help or praising him or what have you. So you've got to understand these things in context. Then you've got to ask, well, what does prayer look like when they do it? And what does it look like in the NAR movement? And here they manufacture a new concept of prayer that is explicitly contrasted with petitionary prayer called, what's it called? Does anybody know what it's called? Declaration prayer.
Oh, Declaration
prayer. Declaration prayer is contrasted with petitionary prayer. Many people will say it sounds like you're actually giving God directions. You're telling God what he's to do next. And it does come across that way. We can illustrate this pretty neatly, I think, though it brings up a tragic case with the story of Olive Heilegental, who was a 2-year-old child a few years ago, the daughter of a worship leader, her mother at Bethel Church in Redding, California, and her father's a member of the church as well. And she passed away as an infant. She was, I think, 2 years old. And the mother believed that God intended to raise her from the dead, and God would raise her from the dead if they engaged in declaration prayer. She sought the leadership of the church. That would include Bill Johnson and Chris Valentin, who is their prophet, and others, to be sure. And they all agreed to engage in this collectively. And it actually went viral. It was in social media. People were
I
participating.
remember watching it. Yeah, I remember
Right.
watching
From all,
it.
and the media was following the story
Yeah.
because it was so prominent in the news, local news, and then it spread. The word spread that Olive was going to be awakened, and so they were declaring her resurrection, not petitioning God to raise her from the dead, which in itself is actually kind of an odd thing. You know, that's not a characteristic practice in the church to pray that deceased loved ones will rise from the dead. We pray for them typically when they are ill, and we ask God if he would be so gracious as to prevent them from dying of their illness. That's a common enough thing, but to pray for a resurrection is not so typical. But this was praying in the declaration manner, and so they were basically asserting this as if doing so and doing so in large numbers would increase the chances of it happening. But you have to believe that it's going to happen in order to be effective. And of course, it didn't happen.
It didn't.
She did not wake up, and eventually they had to bury the body and have a memorial service for her. Now, here's what's interesting. Afterwards, they had a press conference of sorts where they tried to explain why it didn't work out. And when they did,
press release. There was a press release they posted.
it was a press release. Yeah, it wasn't a conference. It was a press release. Thank you, Holly. They explained by resorting to petitionary prayer. When they explained what had transpired, they spoke of what they were doing as if it had been a case of petitionary prayer. And yet in their own teachings, they make a deliberate distinction between petitionary prayer and declaration prayer. And not only do they make a distinction, but they consider petitionary prayer to be inferior. The biblical form of prayer, seeking God's aid in some matter, is inferior from their point of view because it shows a lack of faith. It's a cop-out. I've heard people say this to me. Petitionary prayer is a cop-out because when you petition God, you submit your requests to the outworking of his will. And you say, in effect, as Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane, this is my request, but not my will, but yours be done. And God wants us to pray this way. But in NAR, they think that this is an inferior form of prayer. It's a cop-out. It's a way to get God off the hook when things don't go the way you pray for. But obviously, with declaration prayer, they're all supposed to happen.
Now,
So,
do they try and ground that? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so not only do they make a distinction, but they consider one to be superior to the other. And yet when they practiced declaration prayer in this very public way and had to explain why it didn't work out, they resorted to
and they walked the dog back
talking about it. And it was basically reframing what they were doing.
So they said, oh, well, we were only doing petitionary prayer. Yeah. We weren't doing, or did they say, well, we didn't declare hard enough, or what was?
No, their description, their explanation was in terms of a description of petitionary prayer.
Okay.
So it was one offense on top of another. I think that leadership at the church, they failed pastorally. It was an egregious case of pastoral malpractice when they encouraged the parents to believe that this was going to happen.
So
But
how do they get around Deuteronomy 22? The test of a prophet, because this is pretty clear. If they're claiming to be a prophet, we've got a very clear test in Deuteronomy 22, 18 through 22, that says if God knows the end from the beginning, if a prophet says this is going to happen and it doesn't happen, you shall not fear him. I mean, it's a pretty clear line.
They say it doesn't apply to today's prophets.
Where do they get that from?
Well, they've had help. Remember, I said earlier on that unfortunately, some in our own ranks, evangelicals who should know better, have lent support to some of their ideas because of their own teachings. So, for example, we've got people who believe that New Testament prophecy differs from Old Testament prophecy in being fallible in some sense. Now, the prophecies themselves, if they're actual prophecies, they are words from God and they're not fallible, but the prophet is fallible. And so the prophet can hear God mistakenly, think he has a message from God, but not actually know that it's from God, and so prophesy falsely. He's not passing along a word from God that failed. He's passing along something as if it was the word of God, because he mistook it to be the word of God.
Too bad God doesn't have a safety check in his editing process. That's
this is going on. I mean, listen, this is happening in our own ranks. They will cite the work of Wayne Grudem, for example, in which he argues that New Testament prophecy could err. He even says this about Agabus in the book of Acts, who, when he prophesied that Paul would be arrested by the Jews and bound, and then eventually he'd be handed over to the Romans, if he went to Jerusalem, this was meant to warn him either not to go or at least to be ready. And Grudem thinks that Agabus erred in a small matter. That is, that when he was bound by the Romans, but not by the Jews, when in the fulfillment of this. Now, I think he was bound by the Jews, and then when he was released into the custody of the Romans, he was bound in chains by the Romans. And there's no inconsistency there at all. And I've got a talk that I've developed that deals directly with all of this, and I just find it stunning that someone like that would make this kind of argument. I mean, we're talking about people who defend the inerrancy of Scripture and then will go to great lengths to harmonize passages, but on this particular point where it would be easy to harmonize what Agabus actually prophesied and what did happen, Wayne Grudem says, no, there was an error there. And I think it's because it covers for modern day prophets, whether they are exercising a spiritual gift, as Grudem thinks, or functioning in an office, as Gnarlies think. They can make mistakes, and I just simply don't see it. I'm with you, Lenny. We agree because we put it in our book on means of testing prophets that the Hebrew standard has not been lifted. The one thing that has been lifted is the consequence for failed prophecy. It was a capital offense for a prophet of Israel or anybody who purported to be a prophet of Israel to get it wrong. If he predicted something that did not happen, he was to be executed. It was not a minor thing. Well, it's not a minor thing today either, but we don't live in a theocratic society where we're entitled to take the life of a failed prophet. And that's probably some comfort to people like Chris Valentin and others who have made pretty dramatic public mistakes and said, well, I'm sorry I got it wrong, but it doesn't mean I'm not a
free
prophet.
Life is a modern day prophet, I guess. Right. Yeah. That's, oh boy, that sort of fires up the righteous indignation there.
Well, and we were talking about spiritual abuse, right?
Yeah.
Earlier.
Well, yeah, right.
Okay.
Right.
So we were talking about Mike Bickle's case. Well, where there's been sexual transgression, predatory behavior, even among minors, people will fixate on that as the form of spiritual abuse that's distinctive in that case. And it is true that it is a case of abuse. Let's not forget that. However, I would add that the entire congregation of IHOP, not just in Kansas City, but globally, has been subject to spiritual abuse because they trusted Mike Bickle when he purported to have revelation from God for establishing the movement. And so the abuse is sweeping. And people at this point, I think, are waking up to the scope of the abuse that extends not just to those who were physically assaulted, you could say, but also those who were spiritually assaulted all along by being peddled a lie as to God's revelation to them.
Well, when I hear about these things, I keep thinking of Simon Magus in the Book of Acts, who wants the power, tap into the power that he sees the actual apostles performing through miracles and everything. But that's all he's really interested in. He's not interested in the holiness aspect. And I'm wondering if in these prayer rooms and everything, there's much declaration about, God, make me holy,
Yeah.
sanctify me, make me virtuous in Christ, or if it's all just about, displays of power, just more direct.
Tony, I think you're hitting on something really important here, because the whole movement, and as Holly, when she explained the background on it, it's a very 20th, 21st century thing where I don't know if this whole idea would have ever been able to arisen in a medieval period, but we are in an era where we have heightened individualism, the idea that we have to express ourselves, heightened emphasis on our feelings and our emotions, and of course, in the charismatic movement, generally, feelings and emotions play an outsized role in one's understanding of their relationship to God. But here it seems to be up on steroids. Obviously, they're borrowing aspects of the word faith movement. They've been colored by that as much as they've been colored by, we talked about the leadership and shepherding movements, but all those are symptoms of human depravity. We've seen that, if you look at you go back to the Medici popes, and you've always seen those kinds of abuses. But this specific manifestation of abuse, I think it's telling that the reason why you can hold to the Orthodox creeds. So yes, they're not heretical in that sense. They're not teaching heresies against theology. I mean, heck, when I found out that the song, the Creed, was written by Bethel, I almost dropped my jaw. I was like, wow, because that's a phenomenon. Yeah, it's a great song. But there's this emotive aspect to it that sways me. And that's what concerns me. Number one, that Christians in general are starting to relate their relationship to God to an emotive aspect and not a conforming aspect, virtue, and understanding the theologies. That's a really big concern. And secondly, what makes it even more pernicious is the gateway drug, which is the worship music, which is the concerts that parents will hear Bethel music in concert that will send their 12-year-old or 15-year-old kid, or they themselves will go because, heck, these are the same songs that we sing at my church, and I know my church is safe. And then they'll go to those concerts, and then there will be this prophetic teaching. There will be this idea of how you can manifest these gifts yourself, spoken from the same platform in which these people are already emotionally engaged. And so for the broader church, this isn't necessarily, I won't go to that. I won't attend an IHOP church now. Okay. It's bigger than that. And I think we need to address that going forward.
Yeah. Doug, Holly, do you want to talk about the music aspect of the industry as the way in for a lot of people?
Yeah. A lot of people have told us that the thing that drew them to this movement was the music. And it's actually by design. We have a whole chapter in our book, Counterfeit Kingdom, where we talk, it's called Toxic Worship Music. And Bill Johnson has said that he sees Bethel music and the music of Jesus culture as tools to spread, to plant their teachings and practices in churches throughout the world. And a lot of people don't realize that the lyrics of the music are laced with NAR theology, NAR buzzwords. A lot of people don't recognize that because they don't know the theology. Bethel leaders themselves view the lyrics of songs as declarations, so that when churches are singing the lyrics, from the perspective of the Bethel leaders, these churches, even if they're not NAR churches, are taking part in prayer declarations on Sunday morning by singing these lyrics. But Bill Johnson has also said that music bypasses all of the intellectual barriers. And when the anointing of God is on a song, people will begin to believe things they wouldn't believe through teaching. So he recognizes this, how music can be exploited and to get people to believe things that they wouldn't necessarily believe if they were just taught that in a sermon or something like that. And so the music really is a gateway into the NAR movement. And as we say in our book, Counterfeit Kingdom, music is the catechism of today's church. And so, you hear the same song sung every week. And a lot of times people will leave a church service and the music is still in their head and they're still singing the songs throughout the week, maybe even after they've forgotten the sermon. And so the music is very important to forming people's beliefs and teaching them what to expect, what we should expect in our Christian experience, because a lot of the music is about how we should see miracles occurring regularly. We should be looking for resurrections from the dead, these kind of things. And so it's teaching people what to look for in their Christian experience. If they're not experiencing those things, to feel like there's something wrong with them, to maybe seek out churches. If they're not seeing those things happen in their churches, to seek out NAR churches where they believe those things are happening. Doug might want to add some to that.
There are some key words that I think help us seize upon what it is that's creeping into the church and what makes it attractive. And I was thinking about this when Lenny was speaking. There is a kind of spiritual exhibitionism that appears in this way. It's a demonstration of how spiritual we are when we sing these songs, when we claim to be working miracles on a routine basis. There's a whole mythology of the miraculous surrounding Bethel Church, for example. It's even been regarded by some of their own people as kind of a portal for the transmission of special energies of sorts between heaven and earth. Yeah. And bringing heaven to earth is something that's happening at Bethel Church as a model to the world. The place does matter in their theology. And from a distance, many people find it easy to believe the mythology of the miraculous. But I keep calling it a mythology because it's not really well established. It's not well documented that the things that they're claiming are really happening. And in fact, I think on the contrary, they're grasping at straws when they do try to identify clear cases of the miraculous. We've had discussions with some of their own people or people that have been doing research for them who are, they're about to release some of their research. And I just I can't believe that they're convinced that these are bona fide cases of the miraculous, like unequivocal cases of the miraculous, and then how they can project a whole narrative that this is a routine experience based on such flimsy evidence. So that's a concern that I have. And I hear routinely people say, I probably would disagree with some things about Bethel and what they teach, but it's pretty obvious that God is doing a work there. And my question for them is, well, what makes that so obvious? I mean, why do you think that? What's your evidence for that? What do you mean? And it's usually got something to do with this narrative about the miraculous that I consider to be more of a mythology than anything else. And then if you ask, well, what is it that you disagree with? They don't want to say what they disagree with. So I think there's a fair amount of faking going on, to be honest with you. And I don't think that, unfortunately, in the church today, and I mean this in a very general way, a lot of people think that charismatics and Pentecostals are they kind of have a special corner on discernment and the spiritual gifts, and even if I'm, even people that are not part of the charismatic movement might defer to them because they think there's a kind of spirituality that's manifest in their precincts that's unique. And I can see how people might think that, but we need to actually challenge all these things and look for the evidence for it. Spiritualism is another thing that's creeping into the church today. And Tony, you and I have talked about.
Yeah, we've had several conversations, and the one thing when a lot of things you guys have said, especially about the declarative prayers of declaration that are supposed to sort of force God's hand as if he's not entirely free to do as he wishes or wills.
Right.
I mean, in my studies on neo-paganism and magic in the Bible, this starts to get close to what the magician does. And I don't mean the magician in the David Copperfield, sense of illusion. I mean the magician in the Janus and Jambres sense of control, using certain kinds of incantations, formulated, choreographed words and movements to sort of force the local deity to, perform some kind of pseudo-miraculous act. I mean, this is one interpretation. This is what prevented Moses from entering the promised land, because it demotes Yahweh. It demotes God. It presents God as some kind of lesser deity, like the pagan gods that can be controlled and manipulated if we just do things in a certain way. So that's like one of my major concerns here is with regards to theology proper, doctrine of God, that I don't even know that they have this is not a solid doctrine of God that they have if they think they can force God, the triune God of the Bible, to do things, right?
Yeah.
To me, that impinges on God's freedom. And that's not really God who you're talking about. You're talking about something else. But yeah, and then also I just was wondering, as we talk about this, I mean, I suppose they have no sense of a theology of the cross. I mean, I haven't heard anything about how do they deal with suffering and the suffering of Christ. And when Paul talks about, suffering with Christ, I mean, it seems to me there's nothing there about how we should suffer.
They say it's always God's will to heal sickness or disease. There's no exception. Any idea that God would allow or cause suffering or sickness ever would make him to be like a cosmic child abuser.
So when Paul says, I long to share in the fellowships of his sufferings, I don't know, what do they do with something like that verse? I guess they just skip over it.
Well, they really twist verses like that. I mean, they would say that it's never God's will for us to suffer. I mean, the prosperity gospel and word of faith teachings are part of the NAR. These are revelations that they believe have been restored to the church that were lost through the centuries and have been brought back in by the apostles and prophets. So they really don't have a theology of suffering. If somebody like Bill Johnson's wife passed away not too long ago from cancer after prayer declarations were made for her healing, after he claimed to have a great anointing from healing. After his own father passed away from cancer, he claimed God gave him a greater anointing for healing cancer. Even with all of that, when they pass away, he'll just say, well, it's just a mystery. We can't explain it, but we can't allow our experience, our teaching to go down to our level of experience. That he would say the Bible clearly teaches that it's always God's will to heal. There are no exceptions, and we can't lower our teaching to our level of experience. We have to bring our level of experience up. Obviously, we're missing something, new revelation we need or something like that in order to not see that happen again in the future, so people don't die of sickness or disease.
All right. So well,
that's
Doug,
the case where they don't want experience to guide their theology, but experience is always guiding and directing their theology otherwise. And here we have clear cases where Jesus says, for example, to the blind, concerning the blind man, the man who was blind from birth. This is in John. chapter 9, and the people assume that he must have sinned or his parents must have sinned because it was from birth, and Jesus said, no, this was so that the works of God could be manifest in him, and it would bring God glory. Now, that's a puzzling statement, but he's denying that the man deserved what he had experienced. They will say that Jesus healed everyone, but there are only places, they're like local places, local passages where it says he healed them all on an occasion. But there were plenty of people who were left behind in a certain sense, that they were not healed or delivered of demonic oppression. And so there's that. Now, another thing that was alluded to here, in fact, somebody actually mentioned Simon Magus from the book of Acts, who wanted the same power that he observed the apostles exercising in their healing ministry. I think there are a couple of things there. One is that he wanted something, he was basically just after the power, but the man was coveting something. He coveted something that they had. They had something he wanted for himself. He could embellish his own practices because he was a magician if he could just tap into the same power. Tell me the secret of what you're doing so I can do the same thing. That was coveting. And there's a certain kind of temptation that people have to demand that God do something for them that he hasn't promised us that he would do. We open our recent book, Reckless Christianity, with the account of Bill Johnson prior to becoming the pastor of Bethel Church, or sometime around that time, saying to God, he was pleading with God to give more of himself to Bill Johnson. He wanted God's power at his disposal, and he was pleading with God for more of God. Now, when you ask for more of God and your expectation is that he'll deliver it in the form of power, that's not something promised to us. That sounds more like, what was the
Jim Carrey movie where he becomes
it was Jim
God.
Carrey.
Yeah.
What's
with Morgan Freeman and Jim
Yeah.
Bruce Almighty.
Bruce Almighty. That's a Bruce Almighty mindset.
Yeah.
I want your power. And interestingly enough, Bruce was asking for his power, but he lacked God's wisdom. And he used God's power and created all kinds of havoc for himself and everybody else. And so if you're just asking for more of God and God's power, then what is the source of that? Why is that? What motivates that? And it comes across like I just want a more intimate relationship with God. No, that's the secondary thing. And then to say that our whole ministry is going to be marked by the supernatural, that's going to be the hallmark of the Bethel Church ministry. It's pretty easy to connect the dots and realize that this is really about tapping into the power of God in a unique way.
Yeah, and we tend to want to say that anybody who's given that power would be commensurate with holiness, right? Power would be commensurate with the person's life in Christ, his sanctification, that there's something about sanctification maybe that's going to increase your intimacy with God. Well, that may result in a greater awareness of God's presence, of his love, but that doesn't translate into like worldly power. No. Right. I mean, we think of the martyrs of the church or the great saints of the church. I mean, your greater intimacy with God in virtue of sanctification, or asking for God's greater portion of his presence. Yeah. You still may die in the concentration camp.
Well, Philippians 2 is the ultimate passage here, because Jesus was equal with God. He didn't consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he humbled himself, taking the form of a slave. So he says, I'm not looking for power, I'm looking for servanthood. And because of his servanthood and his death on the cross, then God exalts him. So it's not, the seeking of power is actually antithetical to the model that Jesus provides us.
There doesn't seem to be much of a theme of sacrifice in any of in any
of it. No.
Well, and he reports that in response, he experienced jolts of electricity coursing through his body. So that would be like physical evidence of receiving special power from God, I guess.
Yeah, and then after that, he claims that healings and increased and things like that in his ministry. They do talk in NAR about the end time army that will rise up, the Joel's army, they'll call it, often based on what's described in Joel 1 through 11, where judgment is prophesied to come on Israel if they don't repent, and it will be through this like army of destruction. And they'll see in that a great end time army that God is raising up to execute justice on the nations and things like that. But they'll say that this army will be characterized by purity and power. In fact, IHOP has talked a lot. Mike Bickle talked a lot about this over the years, the importance of the bride of Christ being purified, to be the pure bride so Christ can return. But I mean, obviously, there's a real irony in that, because that was something he really stressed in his message, but that obviously wasn't happening.
Well, and with Bickle then too, given what you've said, it's not like, I mean, it's sort of like right out of the gate in his ministry, in his young ministry.
Yeah.
He's doing things that are utterly impure. It's not like he was a faithful Christian leader who over time sort of fell into temptations or something. It seems like right out the gate, he's talking about things, prophecies they had. He's grooming young women. So
it wasn't just him. Bob Jones was a prophet who was very influential in Mike Bickle's life into the IHOP movement. And he's the one who gave Mike Bickle a lot of the revelation that surrounded the starting of IHOP. And Bob Jones, for those who don't know, he was having women undress in his office so he could give prophetic words to them. And, so this was even the prophets behind IHOP's founding. Paul Cain had his own serious sexual immorality and issues going on as well. And he was another prophet behind IHOP. So at their very core, it's been, filled with this.
Well, this is another feature that maybe we could just at least bring up, because again, I've seen this in other. This was similar to the story of Jean Vanier, who I don't know if you guys are familiar with, but he was a very prominent Roman Catholic who had a very globally renowned ministry, serving the most severe, like handicapped persons, and it was found out later after his death, possibly, that he had groomed all of these women to have these sort of sexual spiritual encounters with, right? And but he was trained by a mentor as well. So one other feature that seems to be here is this sort of this mentoring in these sort of unseemly and immoral practices, right? By, it's sort of like passed down from one so-called prophet to another.
We talk about that in Counterfeit Kingdom. We call it NAR's dirty little secret. Is some of the very most esteemed prophets in the NAR movement are people that had gross sexual immorality. But leaders like Bill Johnson will defend these prophets, and they still hold them up and hold them in high regard. And they'll say really it's like kind of a test of us to see if we'll still receive God's message through these people and get past the offense of this gross immorality and sexual sin. And he'll say it was sin. Bill Johnson will say what they did was wrong, but we need to be able to get past that and receive the revelation that God was giving us through these people.
This is one of the major problems modern evangelicalism has today. It's not that there's sexual sin. There was always been, like I said, there have always been people who've fallen into sexual sin. In general, you can point to even folks who bring up the Roman Catholic churches and the abuses of priests there. That is a sliver of what's happened in secular society. If you compare the number of child abuse cases in the public school system per 1,000 students versus the number of abuse cases in the Roman Catholic Church per 1,000, it's not even close. But here's my bigger problem is we seem to react viscerally to sexual sin. Okay, that's fine. That's not necessarily the only sin we should react viscerally to. That's not even the worst sin per se. Why aren't we reacting to the sin of pride? I think pride is a much, much bigger danger because it corrupts insidiously from the inside. And it leads to abuses, not merely of several dozen women, but as Doug pointed out, hundreds of thousands of individuals across the entire globe. But in our churches today, we don't talk about pride as a sin that can corrupt the church. We don't take the warnings, for example, in the book of Revelation that Jesus gives to the 7 churches and say, here's how we apply them more broadly. We talk maybe about a little bit personal pride. Don't get too puffed up against your brother and guard against it yourself. But we don't talk about pride in our leaders, how we've adopted, modern rock concert and celebrity status ideology for our spiritual leaders as a model that should be followed. We don't talk about teaching our congregants as mature Christians. You need to guard against pride in your leadership. You need to look for certain things. And these are the stumbling blocks that kind of set everything in motion, which is kind of what I was pointing to before. It's easy today and in an emotive state to get excited because your leader's doing so well and you want to be part of that train. God's doing something in him, and it's not that God will do something in me as well. It's like God will, I can be part of the excitement that he's leading and follow him. And I just worry that this is a key aspect of modern evangelicalism that nobody's talking about, but that opens the door for such abuses as you're talking.
Well, and I wonder too, Lenny, just given where we are in history and in the West, and after a long extended battle with scientific naturalism and atheistic conceptions of reality and so on and so forth, that there isn't this hunger for the supernatural, and Doug has used the word mythology and everything. There's just this desire to see more directly supernatural power manifest, which then could set a culture up for false prophets and false and bad actors to come in and play off that hunger, that natural hunger to see like divine power on display, because we've been so secularized for so long. Now I think that's coming back into play big time, but that's what could say like that in a sense the culture has been primed for this.
Yes, and we do use the wrong criteria for evaluating a work of God. Yeah. We think in terms of numbers of people that are showing up coming through the doors on a Sunday morning, or how many books we've published, or we've enrolled in our program, whether it's at a university or an institute somewhere, and how many invitations I've gotten to travel or what have you. And we think all of these are unequivocal signs of God's blessing. And so we think it gives us carte blanche to keep behaving the way that we do. But there are simple signs that we should be watching for in our leaders. I mean, there are small points that Paul addresses in his epistles, having to do with speech and the tongue and coarse jesting, for example. We don't preach about that, but there is abhorrent talk that goes behind closed doors, where carousing and whatnot happens, and it's everybody just kind of looks the other way or chuckles and lets it go. And that should be a sign as well. A simple thing, coarse jesting, jokes, they're off color, things like that. We just think, well, that doesn't register. Those things are not, but they do. They say something about the soul of an individual. And so they should raise flags, and then you should be more cautious and skeptical. about that.
Well, look, this has been really good. This is such a huge issue to address. And, unlike other issues we have to address in the culture, it's subtle, right? It's more subtle than just the atheist, attack against God, or something more even overtly pagan or neo-pagan, because it's all, presented under the, in certain Christian wrapping, right? As we affirm the creed and all this. So it really does take some hard work and discernment to see what the real problem is here. Now getting to number of books. So let's end here. So you have written 4 books now together on the issue. Now I maybe ideally we'd want, the audience to go ahead and get all 4 and read all 4, but is there one of the books that, is the more recent one the one to try and get if you want to learn more about this? You've had 2 come out very recently.
I would say Counterfeit Kingdom, this one.
Yeah.
The Dangers of New Revelation, New Prophets, and New Age Practices in the Church is a good it's a good overview of NAR that will just help people see where the teachings and the practices are entering churches and really what to look out for. If people want to go deeper, though, especially into the teachings of Bethel Church and Bill Johnson, Reckless Christianity, the destructive new teachings and practices of Bill Johnson, Bethel Church, and the global movement of apostles and prophets, we really take a deep dive, and this is more academic.
Okay.
The other book has a lot of footnotes too, but this one has like 700 footnotes or something. It's heavily documented, and we really show that what Bill Johnson teaches. And we don't, with Counterfeit Kingdom, we can't go into layers of argumentation, but with Reckless Christianity, we can go into more layers of argumentation.
All right. So I definitely want to recommend to our audience to, get at least one of those books and read. I know people who have family members at Bethel, and it's torn the family apart.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very, Doug, you know who I'm talking about. You've met him yourself, and it's hard because a lot of the people going to these churches they do sort of have a heart for Christ. They have a heart for Jesus, right? Yeah. But they're getting, so a lot of people are just sort of getting caught up in it. And then it's causing so much damage. So,
we're encouraged though. We are hearing testimonies, and even this week we've received some testimonies from people that are in NAR and leaving because they have been alerted to some of these things, and they've commended us. One thing I like to tell people, and of course this is taking my word for it, I'm passing along from others, but one of the things that we've heard from people who were leaders in the NAR movement and left, and others who went through the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, let's say all 3 years, and they left, they will tell us, and have told us many times, that we're spot on, that our description is accurate, that it's fair, it's even-handed, it's well documented, and that there's nothing. I was interviewing, we were actually in a Zoom meeting interviewing with a leading church leader who had spent many years in NAR environs and in participating in leadership. And he left the movement, and he described his own experience and why that was. And I said, we don't expect everybody to agree with everything we say. And you've said that you've read our book. We'd be happy to hear what your impression is. And he said, I can't disagree with anything you've said in terms of your description of it. So I think that could help those that are watching and listening, because you do wonder, there is, people can get shrill in their criticism and then maybe exaggerate what's wrong. And we've tried not to do that. We've been very diligent trying to do our homework and document things, dot the I's and cross the T's, so that we can't be accused of putting words in their mouth or taking things out of context.
Yeah. Well, and that is, and Doug, I wrote enough analytic outlines for you to know that you're going to be careful with data and information, and do good research. And that is important especially in a day and age where, too, with the technology we have and everybody having a podcast and wanting to cry heresy, 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 that we're not overreacting, but they're reacting accordingly and appropriately to what the real issue is and where the real problems are. And I think, you guys have done that. I read the first 2 books. I haven't read the third one yet, but so that's good. So people know that, I got a trusted and fair and balanced report here of what's going on. So again, I definitely want to recommend that people look into this issue. So thanks again for coming on, guys. And good luck with the new book, and maybe we'll do it again another time.
Well, thank you
Thank
both
you.
for hosting and leading a very stimulating discussion about an urgent topic.
Yes, thank you.
All right. God bless.